African leaders have concluded a rare visit to Washington, D.C. on an invitation of US President Barack Obama. Trade and security dominated those talks.
So many leaders, so many cultures, so many languages, not to mention a lot of travel. Was it all worth it? The US wants a greater part of a growing continent.
Now Africa offers the best opportunities on the planet, and it also offers the best returns for investments.
President Obama says America is in it for the long run, so he's tripling the ambition of his flagship Power Africa project, which aims to get private firms to bring electricity to 60 million more African homes and businesses.
The leaders here pledged to step up efforts to pursue reforms that attract investment, reduce barriers that stifle trade, especially between African countries, and to promote regional integration.
Outside of official meetings, expatriate Africans have been asking the US president to use the prestige of his office to urge his invited guests to avoid abuses of their leadership powers. Inside the summit, US officials want greater participation by civil society groups in Africa and are encouraging government reforms.
Fighting corruption is a definitive, critical part of that process. To do so will take courage. And yes, it sometimes means assuming risks. But fighting corruption lifts more than a country's balance sheet. Transparency and accountability attract greater investment.
African corporate leaders want investments in education on a continent with the largest proportion of young people. First Lady Michelle Obama says that women and girls have to be a key element.
But the bottom line is that until men, leaders, women, until we value women and girls, we won't tackle those other problems.
The idea of unlocking the potential of young Africans has been a key theme during this gathering. African security experts say the poverty and exclusion of young people could provide extremist groups with an opportunity to gain greater influence.
For some highlights, we're now joined from Washington, D.C. by CCTV's Daniel Ranges. He's standing by for us. Daniel, the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit has come to a close. What is the reaction from Washington now that that summit is over?
I think actually it was generally a success. All of the parties were on form. They managed to cover a broad range of topics. And I don't think any of the leaders were upset. There didn't seem to be any big problems with the organization, although some of my media colleagues were finding it difficult to get in. So overall, I think what President Obama achieved was a platform for his legacy on Africa. As you know, he'd been criticized for not doing enough on Africa. He had a lot of other priorities going on, not least in the Middle East. So I think the sheer scale of this has actually worked effectively to project an image of America concerned and wanting to engage in Africa.
Well, wanting to engage in Africa, though, Daniel, but there was a perception on the continent, at least, that perhaps America was reacting to another force. Is that sentiment shared in Washington?
Well, I think it's the sort of thing that analysts often say, but in reality, I think throughout this conference, the Americans have made clear that they are not directly competing with China, that there are many opportunities in Africa for the development, for example, of infrastructure, and they welcomed that. And I think that there is a different approach from the Obama administration. It's not as if the Americans are going to go into Africa and say, we're going to transform Africa. This is a different kind of mindset. They're saying we want to contribute to the formation of a new Africa that is stronger in governance, stronger in its economy, respectful of its people. And ultimately, we want there to be an American interest, which is to be able to trade and also to ensure our own security and all of our interests related to militancy and to development. So this is not a zero-sum game, it's a broad-based approach.
Well, there are going to be about $14 billion, Daniel, though, in private sector initiatives now from the U.S. To Africa. Is there still, though, a case to be made for aid and probably the aid-related policies by the U.S. on the continent?
Well, yes, but not to the extent before. So, for example, in the case of HIV/AIDS, George W. Bush pumped huge billions of dollars into the HIV effort. The funding will still be maintained, but it certainly won't be increased in an atmosphere here in Washington where it's difficult to get additional taxpayer money out of the politicians who are much more careful about these things. Instead, I think what you are going to see is much more targeted expertise going into helping African governments, particularly those that are well-resourced, for example, South Africa, to enable them to have better strategies going forward. So it's more, I think, about intellectual capital. That being said, there are still significant resources of aid going into Africa.
All right, Daniel Ranges for us there in Washington, D.C. Thank you. Now, coming within a backdrop of waning American influence in Africa and long after China overtook the U.S. as Africa's #1 trading partner, the U.S.-Africa summit is receiving varied interpretations. Now, could Washington be finally conceding that its finger-wagging big stick diplomacy has failed in Africa? And how does the U.S. development model for Africa compare with China's? And did this contribute to the U.S. losing ground to China on the continent? Well, joining us from Washington, D.C. to discuss this interesting development is Amira Woods, Associate Fellow, Institute of Policy Studies and Global Client Principal for Social Impact Programs at ThoughtWorks. From Beijing is Professor Ho Wenping, the Director of the African Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. And in studio with me is Professor Peter Kagwanja, the Chief Executive of the Africa Policy Institute. Thank you for joining us here on the program. Professor Kagwanja, I'll start with you now. The U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit has been billed as unprecedented for many reasons, but strikingly, we saw a different tone, though, from American officials. Is the United States in a state of panic?
I think for a number of years, perhaps decades, the West in general and the U.S. in particular tended to ignore Africa. And if you follow the debates, they were marked by what we call Afro-pessimism, which simply meant that Africa is not the place to go, Africa is not the place to invest, Africa is hopeless, there is no future in that continent and its people. That basically discouraged any investment from the West, and the few that came in were conflict-related, you know, stopping conflict and so on. At the same time, Africa itself was undergoing its own renaissance and was convinced that the 21st century is its century. And the South-South cooperation started kicking in with China, with Brazil, with India, and so on. Now, what you are seeing now is a country, the United States, trying to catch up with the rest of the world in regard to what is emerging as African revival.
All right, I'll ask that to Amira. Amira, is the United States now trying to catch up with other players on the continent like China?
Well, I think the U.S. has been focused on three things: countering China, accessing resources, especially oil, gas, mining, those extractive industries, as well as land, and really militarizing its engagement with Africa. So I think the investments have been there, but what they have done is really reinforce the status quo. What we see, I now work with ThoughtWorks, which is a global technology firm committed to economic and social justice. And what we see as the biggest issue of our time, both in Africa and around the world, is inequality. And really, U.S. policies have contributed to inequality, getting, again, those haves have gotten more and the have-nots have been pushed to the margins in Africa and around the world.
I'm going to come back to this, Amira.
Summits come and go.
Let me just step in here, Amira, and just focus a little bit now on this just concluded summit, though. You're talking about America having contributed to inequalities around the world. In Africa particularly, many are now asking, America is asking for a partnership with Africa. Where has America been all this time?
Well, I think America, if you look at who was around the table this week at the summit, you see Americans have been very involved. It's been the CEOs of the extractive industries, big oil, very much at the table, the mining conglomerates, very much at the table, and those interested in acquiring Africa's land. So it is the policies that are set in Washington. It is the business practices, the trade and investment practices that have been put in place not just now, but for decades, some say centuries now, right, with the U.S. and Africa, that have created this deplorable circumstance.
All right, Professor Ho Weng-Ping, you've been following very closely that situation in Washington, the meeting between the African leaders and the United States officials. What's the thinking in Beijing about this?
Well, I think we welcome the opening and this taking place of the very first Africa and U.S. summit. I think this is a good thing, and the more outside stakeholder focus on Africa's development, the better outcome we would like to see. So I think, but anyhow, the opening of this U.S.-Africa summit itself is a vivid a proof that the U.S. now is really very worried up about the lag behind of United States, the involvement with Africa, especially lag behind with China and Brazil, India, like my African colleagues has mentioned. Now the South-South cooperation has taken the momentum. So for the United States, since the year 2009, its trade volume with Africa has already becoming the second to the China-Africa trade volume. So, also for other domain like agricultural cooperation, right, like also the investment, they all feel now it's the time for catch up. So that's the biggest message we have heard. That's the biggest message you have heard, but the U.S. is now focusing more, though, on trade and investment, and it didn't talk much about human rights and democracy during the summit. Are you seeing, though, the United States at this point now copying the Chinese model, which seems to have worked in Africa? Yes, the summit itself, I think, is a kind of copy about the China-African summit taking place in the year 2006. So, but they haven't copied in a very concrete way. For example, the China-African summit, we have the bilateral talks summit between the Chinese president and with each of those African heads of the state. But in the U.S.-African summit, I haven't heard this kind of talk. And even the United States turned down the request coming from African heads of states. So, and another difference is we haven't heard any action plan has been dropped by the U.S.-African summit. So there's no action plan so in a very detailed way to make a roadmap for the future U.S.-African cooperation. We only heard a general sum of promise, saying 33 billion US dollar. But when you break down all that kind of package, you will see 14 billion just belong to those entrepreneurs, those contract signed, and another 14 coming from the World Bank and the Swedish government. So they give their support to the Power Africa initiative. So the real sum coming from the United States, the government, I think is still quite limited. All right, Professor Kagwanja, that talk by Professor Ho Weng-Ping about the lack of a concrete action plan.
I think this was the inaugural US-Africa summit. And as an inaugural summit, one would assess it in terms of the preparedness. It has all the making of what you can call a knee-jerk reaction for fairness, because if you compare it with, for example, the Japanese process, or the FOCAC process of China, or the India process with Africa, it lacks a number of things. First, the agenda, apart from the general headlines of finance, trade, and security, it is not broken down into what exactly you're doing. Two, it remains suspended at that multilateral level. You don't see any concrete percolation of the debate to the bilateral level. For example, the Kenyans would ask, what is in the conference for Kenya, on that conference for Kenya?
Right.
The Ugandans would ask, what is in it for us? That did not come out very clearly. The follow-up process is not very clear. I think that's what Professor Ho Wenping is calling an action plan.
Right.
What is the predictability that we have this in the future, and how frequent is it going to be? You do know that the Chinese FOCAC process is taking place every 3 years.
Right.
So, in other words, the follow-up process is not very clear. Finally, it appears that although the invitation is by the US government, the follow-up process is supposed to be by American business. And there is no clear commitment that the business is going to come. The $14 billion promised might not necessarily become a reality because it's not a commitment as such, it's a plan.
All right. Amira, what exactly then did come out of this summit? At the end of the day, what are the concrete actions? What are the concrete plans? What next?
Without a doubt, the summit was a wonderful photo opportunity. There was a celebration of President Obama on his birthday on Monday, you know, but in terms of the concretes, there was very little. What you had were the CEOs of these extractive industries coming together with heads of states, many of whom are, you know, quite repressive, making deals. And I think the problem there is that is very much a continuation of more of the same, exploiting basic workers, exploiting the rights of people on whose land these resources lie, in the interests of the 1%, you know, the heads of those extractive industries and also the local elites that do their bidding. So I think we fundamentally don't have the substantive change that was needed to actually bring in place you know, improve conditions on the continent or in the global economy.
All right, Amira Woods, we'll leave it there for the moment. And Peter Kagwanja here with me in studio, and Professor Ho Wenping in Beijing will return in just a moment.
I want Mr. President to dwell so much on security. There is no reasonable investor that will invest in an environment that is not conducive for a business.
We have fundamental issues. Trending right now is the issue of Ebola and security issues in Nigeria, which is very important. It's very glaring that when it comes to security issue, we are not capable. This government is not capable at the moment, and we need help.
Nothing. It's a photo opportunity with President Barrack Obama. Africans, we must find out homemade solutions to homemade problems.
They wanted us to support homosexuality, and our president refused. And now if you tell me about going to America, there's nothing you're going to gain because you already rejected what they want.
With the US intervention in South Africa in terms of investment, maybe that could help increase our employment rate.
Well, to me, it doesn't really mean anything, because I think as we are as Africans, I think we are able to stand on our feet on our own.
I think it could be good for us if the Americans actually intend on listening to the Africans genuinely. If it's not about the Americans, it has to actually be about the Africans.
Africa needs capital. In some cases, Africa needs technical assistance. Africa certainly needs access to markets. But perhaps the biggest thing that Africa is going to need to unleash even more the potential that's already there and the growth that's already taking place is laws and regulations and structures that empower individuals and are not simply designed to control or empower those at the very top.
All right, welcome back to the program. Now, is there still a place, though, for tied aid and diplomatic sanctions in Washington's future ties with Africa? Well, still with us on the program is Emira Woods. From Beijing is Professor Ho Wenping, and in studio with me is Professor Peter Kagwanja. Peter Kagwanja, I'll start off with you now. Is this now a significant turning point in Africa's relations with the United States?
I would agree that this is a turning point. It's a turning point in terms of in regard to the terms of engagement between Washington and Africa. And the question is whether the engagement is going to be dictated by Washington or is going to be originated from Africa. And I think increasingly the agenda is going to be set by the Africans. Because the Africans can now do pick and choose, given that the world is becoming broader. They can go to Beijing, they can go to New Delhi, they can go to Sao Paulo, or any other capital in the world. So Africa is beginning to become increasingly assertive. It is beginning to become increasingly determined to shape its own destiny. And I don't think the West, or the US in particular, is going to have it easy to putting AIDS conditionalities as they were in the 1990s.
Is there still room, though, for AIDS conditionalities? Because the US officials were categorical, at least, that Africa is now the new marketplace for the future.
That's what one would want to stress, that there is only a place and space for mutual partnership that are equitable, that are mutually respectful. The big stake kind of diplomacy is over. That's what is very clear. If you look at the US summit, it's a concluded summit. One thing that was very clear is that the US dropped all matters that are contentious about Africa. There was no mention of gay rights in an open space. And when President Obama talked about the need for laws and regulations, he talked like any other corporate director, talking about we need laws and regulations to govern the place, which is a very benign talk. It's not like the use of governance. You need governance, you need accountability, you need transparency, you need not to be corrupt. That heavy language by the Bretton Woods system, it was missing in this one. And I guess that heralds a new or emerging relations between Washington and Africa.
All right. Professor Ho Wenping, clearly something has changed here. Do you see a different setup now for Africa coming from the United States?
Certainly. I think now we are entering the 21st century. So those old model of engagement between those colonized power with the Africa, I think now cannot keep the pace with the time. So they have to switch the focus from the security only and also move to the trade and the investment and to trying to embrace fully with the African countries. So that is why even those words of sanction, if anyone, they don't obey to the order coming from the White House, or they have to be put on the name list like the ICC. So they are not qualified even to go to the DC, to go to the Washington DC. So this time I think it should be over.
All right, Professor Kagwanja.
I think that's the new approach.
That's the new approach there, but I just want to come back to a comment you made earlier that American officials and President Obama actually put the issues that are contentious in Africa, they put that in the back burner. This is quite a climb down, though, for the United States.
It is a climb down, but I think it is more of a tactical climb down. A tactical climb down because the space of the American policy is not just the state. It is not just the business. The United States has increasingly come to do its business in civil society. It has also come to do its business in terms of projecting the future of leadership. And I think this is where the summit came up stronger. Before the heads of state arrived, already America has engaged civil society in full, and it had engaged the youth who are the future leaders of the continent. And therefore, the place to watch about how business is transacted in the future is not the present. It is basically to project into the future because, believe it or not, America is beginning to nurture a new kind of leadership for the continent that is likely to do business with America. And I think that's a challenge for India, it's a challenge for China, it's a challenge for Japan and other people who want to do transaction in business.
All right, Amira, you did talk about businesses in America, purely this being about extracting Africa's resources. America is nurturing a new type of leadership in Africa. Do you agree?
Well, I think that's the rhetoric of the administration, but the reality of what we saw this week is that civil society was very much marginalized. They were not invited to the big soirees with the heads of state and the CEOs. It was entirely, heads of state, CEOs in a privileged position. So I think, the rhetoric is to reach out to young leaders. The rhetoric is to reach out to civil society. But quite frankly, the reality is that the CEOs and the power of the corporations, particularly US corporations interested in Africa's oil, Africa's liquefied natural gas, those vital resources that the global economy is thirsting for, I think those people, those stakeholders are in a privileged position, and there's a lot of lip service to inclusion of others, but quite frankly, they were very much on the margins throughout this week of the summit.
All right, they were very much on the margins, and I do remember the White House actually talking about on the issue of gay rights, I believe it was. They did mention that due to the sensitivity of the traditions and cultures of Africa, it was difficult to talk about that situation at that time. Well, why do you think that the civil society was marginalized during this time?
Well, I think the structure, for example, of the Young Leaders Initiative, they came a month ago and many of them had left, and civil society overall is not valued. Workers are not valued. There are trade unionists that were in town this week that did not have the same platform as those CEOs, So I think there needs to be an understanding that the economy of the 21st century is absolutely dependent on workers. And if you are not able to get representatives, particularly where you have organized trade unions that have competent representatives, they were here in Washington, but they didn't have that platform. So it is paying attention to people, those who are most at the forefront of the economy. It's workers, it's farmers, it's fisher folk. I feel like, instead of these grand summits in the White House, we need to be thinking about people's conventions or, at national level and then throughout, the continental level, where the agenda setting is made by people and their leaders are then able to represent the agendas set by their own people. It's almost as if we're in the reverse, where we're privileging particularly the CEOs and the heads of states at the expense of those whose lives are really dependent on these policies.
All right, Professor Ho Weng Ping, I'll give you the final word on this. It was really quite a gamble for the United States officials there. Did it pay off? Did it achieve its intended objectives? And what did you take home from this conference?
Well, we have taken home the message sent by the White House and by the President Obama. That is, now the United States also wants to engage heavily with Africa. So I think that this is, I don't see this is going to be heavily competing with China in Africa. Africa is a huge continent. It's big enough to embrace all kinds of stakeholders outside of the continent. So, and actually, I think we also have a greater room to cooperate with United States to, to contribute jointly to the development of Africa. So actually, even the economic competition is not a bad thing. I think it's a good thing for economic development if it is in a good way, managed in a good way.
All right, Professor Peter Kagwanja, Chief Executive, Africa Policy Institute, and from Washington, Amira Woods, Associate Fellow, Institute of Policy Studies and Global Client Principal for Social Impact Programs at Fort Works, and in Beijing, Professor Ho Weng Ping, Director of the African Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. To you all, thank you for being on Talk Africa. I'm Beatrice Marshall in Nairobi. Goodbye.